Mobility International USA. She also works one-on-one with exchange professionals and individuals with disabilities and interviews exchange alumni with disabilities about their international experiences. Welcome, Ashley. It is a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you to everyone who's here today. I'm so happy to see so many people who are interested in this topic, and I'm really glad that you could all join us. Again, my name is Ashley, and I represent Mobility International USA, which, as Anne said, is a nonprofit dedicated to empowering people with disabilities around the world by encouraging their participation in international exchange as well as in international development. But today I'm going to be focusing on international exchange and how, with your help, we can send and welcome more people with disabilities across borders for the same kinds of life-changing exchange experiences that we've had or that other people, our other participants have had. During this webinar, I'm going to be sharing some best practices for working with participants with disabilities in your exchange programs, such as planning for inclusion, working with your overseas partners, arranging accommodations, and inclusive outreach. I'll then briefly discuss some of MIUSA's free resources that are available to you so that you have access to those when you have questions. Later on, my MIUSA colleague Megan Smith is going to share some of her experiences as a world traveler with a disability. And as Anne mentioned, we're going to save some time for your questions at the end. So please hold on to your questions at that time. I also wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. There are also some features in the top menu. See, there's a little icon of a person raising a hand. There are some options in there where you can let me know if you need me to speak up, slow down, etc. For participants who indicated a vision or hearing disability, I may take just a brief moment to describe some certain images out loud. And as some of you can see, we have made captions available at the bottom of the screen for those with hearing disabilities. So before we begin, I'd like to find out what kinds of organizations you are representing. I'm going to open a poll here, which you should be able to hopefully see on the right. Please mark whether your organization or institution is primarily involved in sending volunteers abroad, arranging study abroad programs, bringing international students or visitors to the US, whether you represent a disability organization or if you're just here as an individual. Or if none of these quite fit, you can just mark the other box. Okay, it looks like we have, oh, great, lots of organizations that have international student or visitor programs, as well as some who are involved in study abroad programs. Excellent. Although I think others who are here will also be able to learn some useful strategies for encouraging more people with disabilities to get involved in citizen diplomacy as well. So many of you will already be familiar with the concept of citizen diplomacy, which is this idea that through international exchange, individuals themselves can help shape foreign relations through their friendships, their partnerships, and the connections that they make. They're essentially taking on a role as unofficial ambassadors through their interactions with people from other countries. And I'd like to explain how within this concept of citizen diplomacy, there are many different categories of what a citizen diplomat can be. Plus, I'll show you some photos and quotes that demonstrate how people with diverse disabilities can be active in pretty much any of them. Citizen diplomats can be students. They can be teachers or ESL instructors. They are athletes. Actually, there's a photo on the right of a young man who did both. He went to Japan originally as an English teacher and then stayed on to train in judo. He is blind. Citizen diplomats with disabilities can be involved in the fine arts or in the performance arts. They can be volunteers, including those in the Peace Corps. They are hosts and homestays who welcome international visitors, whether or not the visitor has a disability as well. And finally, they're ambassadors. As one youth ambassador explained it, anyone can engage in citizen diplomacy. All it takes is awareness of issues at home and abroad and a desire to reach across boundaries. So by participating in international exchange, whether as students or volunteers or any of these other forms, citizen diplomats with disabilities are not only broadening the idea of who can represent their country, they're also challenging stereotypes about what people with disabilities can and can't do. So really quickly, I'm going to put another poll out there for you. I'd like to just know how many of you have had a person with a disability participate in your programs before. And keep in mind that a disability doesn't have to be just physical or sensory. It can be a learning disability, mental health related, chronic medical condition, intellectual, or other type. And it's okay if you're not sure. Wow, it looks like many of you have worked with or at least heard of someone with a disability in your programs. That's really great. Hide these polls. Well, whether or not you've worked with someone with a disability in the past, it's never too early or too late to plan for inclusion in your programs. So rather than simply reacting to each time a person with a disability takes part, you can instead proactively weave principles of inclusion into the program design, even before anyone with a disability joins, so that your organization will be more prepared. The goal is not really to necessarily find a one-size-fits-all approach for disability accommodations or to even be an expert on disability. Instead, it's more about being able to find some options and having some options available to you. This was really going to save you time later so that when a person with a disability does participate, you can work with him or her to decide which of the options you've already researched would be the most appropriate. While many arrangements will be specific to the individual or to the program site, there are some steps you can take now, starting with your institutional practices. For example, does your organization have a statement on its commitment to diversity and non-discrimination? And if so, does it include disability? If you place exchange participants in homestays, are you making a note of which homes are close to the main program site or to public transportation? Which would make it a lot easier for a person who is blind or who uses mobility aids to get around. Are you budgeting for reasonable accommodations, such as providing print materials in alternative formats or hiring a sign language interpreter? If your program arranges group insurance for participants, is there a way you can negotiate coverage for pre-existing conditions or mental health, or can you take out a supplementary policy? Another example, do you have a standard process through which accepted participants can request disability-related accommodations? So these are just a few ideas of things you can start thinking about now. You can also offer trainings for your staff, interns, and volunteers so that they can build their familiarity with disability, and especially with your organization's disability-inclusive policies. You want your staff to perceive people with disabilities as assets, so that they can be encouraging when a person with a disability inquires about your programs. Even if they don't know the answer to a specific question, there's definitely a big difference between a response like, I'm not sure, we're not really set up for that, versus, oh, great question, I'd like to do some research on that and find out about some of the options. So the difference in tone can make a huge impact. Finally, consider hiring qualified people with disabilities as staff, consultants, interns, or volunteers. Many of them have a lot of inclusion experiences that they can share. Program alumni with disabilities. Many of you indicated that you've worked with them before. If they have a lot of great insight, they can be a valuable resource for information, not only to your staff, but to peers as well. Next, recognize that there is diversity within disability. As I mentioned during our poll, there are many types of disabilities beyond physical or sensory. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a law which protects people in the US from discrimination, defines someone with a disability as someone with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And this definition is pretty broad and can cover disabilities such as learning disorders, diabetes, major depression or deafness, in addition to physical disabilities. But keep in mind that the way disability is defined in the US may be different from how it's defined in other countries or which disabilities are recognized. As more and more people with disabilities take advantage of opportunities to travel abroad, we're finding that disability overall is not as underrepresented in international exchange as it once was, but some types of disabilities are still very underrepresented. Even if two people have a similar disability, don't assume that they will both have the same needs or experiences. For example, one person who is deaf may communicate using sign language, while another may be used to speaking aloud and reading lips or listening with an assistive device. One may identify as a member of the disability community, while the other may not think of themselves as having a disability at all. It really depends. Be aware that there are cultural differences related to disability, which can include differences in disability-related terminology. You know, you might hear outdated language, outdated for our culture, still being used in another country. Perceptions, there might be differences in the perceptions of independence, as well as approaches to how accommodations are provided, if at all. There are also different models of how people think of disability, including the traditional medical model, which defines disability as something that the individual needs to be cured of or overcome, versus the more progressive social justice model, which instead places the responsibility on society and not on the individual to change in order to remove the barriers that keep people from disabilities from fully participating in society. When it comes to arranging disability-related accommodations for an individual, there are several things to take into consideration, such as accessible transportation, hotels, adaptations for excursions, etc. And then don't get too overwhelmed. Remember, you're not expected to know everything that is needed. Instead, the person is the expert on his disability and can tell you what equipment, services, or strategies that he currently uses in daily life. He might be able to tell you which of these things he would be able to take overseas with him. And he can also explain how he anticipates navigating the transportation, housing, program activities, and other differences in the host community. Meanwhile, you are the expert on the structure of the program and context of the host environment. So you can share these facts with the individual in your conversations. The more descriptive you are, the easier it'll be for the two of you to interpret rather than to assume what would be needed. Earlier on, I talked about how you might be able to research some different accommodations options in advance. But it is your conversation with the individual that will ultimately help inform which of these options may be the most appropriate. The best time to have a discussion about accommodations needs is soon after the individual is accepted into the program. Many programs encourage their participants to disclose a disability early on to make sure that accommodations can be arranged in time in the host country. However, many applicants fear that being forced to discuss this in an application could hurt their chances of being accepted into the program altogether. So instead, something you can do is include a statement on the application that says something like, participants with disabilities are encouraged to disclose after acceptance. Once participants are notified of acceptance, you can include a form in the acceptance packets that allow them to request accommodations or to request an appointment with a knowledgeable staff person to discuss them further. MISA can help in order to guide your conversations with the individual about her accommodations needs. MISA has some sample disability accommodations forms available on its website for free. And we have different forms available for different disability types. So do let me know if that's something that you're interested in, or I can include a link in a follow-up email later today. Many exchange organizations wonder about their responsibilities for providing accommodations. A few notes about that. The ADA, which I mentioned earlier, does require U.S. organizations to make appropriate accommodations for people with disabilities. Some examples of this might include building a ramp to the U.S. headquarters, hiring a sign language interpreter when interviewing a deaf applicant, or providing program materials in large text for someone with low vision, for instance. Non-US citizens are also covered while they're in the United States, and even in some other cases. Although the ADA cannot guarantee the same rights outside of the United States, your organization can still make a good faith effort to comply with the ADA by assessing, the general program accessibility, and you can also research some background information for each overseas site. In some settings, countries, and programs, full accessibility by US standards is not always going to be possible. But you can work to offer creative accommodations and assistance in order to always improve program access. We had this question recently. You can always choose to go above and beyond the minimum requirements outlined by the ADA. You'll never be in violation of the ADA for going above and beyond. In order to fund accommodations, decide to agree in advance with stakeholders how accommodations will be funded and arranged. If your organization partners with schools to send students abroad or to bring them to the US, can you share the costs with those schools? Also, most schools, colleges, and universities will have a disability services professional or office on campus, at least the schools in the US. So whenever possible, encourage students to utilize these services. One instance is where Humphrey Fellows come to the US. Many of them have a study component, and they can certainly take advantage of disability-related services at their host school. Because non-US citizens who are enrolled in or teaching at a US university have access to these same services. You can also budget for reasonable accommodations by incorporating a disability accommodation line item or supplemental fund. We generally recommend designating about 1 to 3% of the program costs towards this fund if you anticipate just one or maybe just a few people with disabilities. But you could also consider a higher portion if you also have staff with disabilities. Here at MIUSA, for example, when we need to hire an ASL interpreter or purchase adaptive technology, we try to cost it out as far as wherever possible. The next best practice is collaborating with overseas partners. This is a step that's often missing in making inclusive people-to-people exchanges. It's important to communicate to your overseas partners that your organization includes people from diverse backgrounds, and that could include people with disabilities. Your organization can, if you have foreign affiliates or contracting partners overseas, make it clear to them that the expectation that people with disabilities should be able to participate equally is something that you're committed to. This can be done when establishing new partners or renewing overseas agreements. While this might be a new concept in some countries, so that's something to keep in mind, but US organizations can help educate your foreign partners about methods for including people with disabilities. Some important tips to keep in mind during your discussions is to focus on how, not whether or if, to include people with disabilities in your programs. The partner might be hesitant about how is a participant with a disability going to manage in our country? It's not, there are all these accessibility barriers. Well, in that case, it might be encouraging to remind your partner that people with disabilities live in communities all over the world and are managing, and they're part of society. You can also let the partner know that you work with the individuals to learn about their needs and requests, and you will communicate these on an as-needed basis. MIUSA can help you there as well, and we can help you research some disability-related resources in the host country. Although the overseas partners might also be familiar with some local organizations. If your organization welcomes international visitors to the US, you might need to reassure the overseas partner that you will equally welcome people with disabilities, and that should someone with a disability show interest in the exchange, they should go ahead and move forward in the process just as they would with any other applicant. Many international visitors who have a chance to visit or learn about US disability organizations often report learning a lot of new ideas and skills for independent living that sometimes they bring back with them. So now that you know many of the basics about weaving inclusion into your programs, you can also think about how to be inclusive in your outreach when recruiting diverse pools of applicants. Think about the ways in which you share information about your programs. Again, a message such as, people with disabilities and others encouraged to apply, or we provide reasonable accommodations upon request. These kinds of messages can go a long way if added to your brochures or website. If your materials feature photos of people traveling, make sure people with visible disabilities are represented when possible. I recently learned about a website with stock images of people with disabilities traveling. And I can share that with whoever's interested. Of course, if you have photos from alumni, that's all the better. Another thing you can do is to make your program and application materials accessible, which includes websites, is for text, you can use clear, simple language, short sentences and messages. You can use colors that contrast well. Make sure to include alt tags for photos on your websites that briefly describe what the photo shows, especially if it adds to the context of what's on the page. So for example, you might have a map on your website that shows the different countries where participants go or where they come from. And you can include an alt tag that says something that captures that. You can also have some brochures available in Braille, large print, or electronic disc on hand, in your office, or if you go to things like study abroad fairs or other kinds of conferences. If you include alumni success stories or quotes in your materials or website, make sure to invite your alumni with disabilities to share theirs too. Financial assistance, one of the best tools for encouraging the participation of people who are traditionally underrepresented in international exchange. You can offer scholarships specifically for members of underrepresented communities, which many organizations do. They have a diversity scholarship. Or if you have broader scholarships, ensure that they're awarded to a diversity of applicants. I don't know, are there any members from the Building Bridges Coalition here? It looked like some of them had registered. One example is how certain volunteer-sending organizations are providing Wofford Fellowships to encourage people to go participate in citizen diplomacy, and MIUSA was able to partner with one of them to help nominate some people with disabilities for those fellowships. And it's our hope that eventually, even without MIUSA, they'll be able to reach out to the disability community to let them know about their programs and funding opportunities. So in order to do that, you can network with some local, regional, or national disability organizations, which MIUSA can help you identify. Try to find contacts at organizations that are led by and work with people with disabilities in order to assist you in your recruiting efforts. They can also help answer your questions about accommodating participants with disabilities in exchange, so it's doubly useful in that sense. Some good ideas for places to do outreach to in order to get the word out to people with disabilities is sharing information with university disability services offices. Some universities even have a Students with Disabilities Alliance. You can contact local independent living centers, adaptive recreation programs, disability rights organizations, as well as support groups. I recently talked to someone who volunteers with a center that brings international visitors to the community, as I saw many of you work in that as well. She reached out to a local chapter of a disability organization to recruit host families. It was an organization that she belonged to herself as a person with a disability, and she was able to recruit a woman who uses a wheelchair to host one of the visitors. This is really wonderful because now in the future, if they have international visitors who have disabilities or who have if someone uses a wheelchair, they know that they have at least one host who has a wheelchair accessible home. Although it's not necessary to always pair a person with disability with another person with disability, of course. Another tip, ask organizations to post an announcement about your programs in their newsletters or social media. A lot of disability organizations are on Facebook and Twitter these days. So beyond the nuts and bolts of inclusive programming, one of the most important things that I want to emphasize to you and to your organizations that promote citizen diplomacy is to be creative and flexible. I'm sure you ask all your participants to do the same. I mean, let's face it, all travelers with or without disabilities will have to adjust to a lot of changes and a lot of new adjustments. So although some programs or sites may have a reputation for being not as accessible as others, what you can do is share as much information as possible, not to discourage, but rather to help the participant make an informed choice about whether she's up for the challenge. We call that challenge by choice. Some people are willing to make these big adjustments, in the ways in which they exercise their independence, the kinds of attitudes they're willing to encounter, the kinds of physical barriers that they're willing to deal with, the rigors of the program, etc. Not everyone is, as willing to do that, and that's fine. It's just a choice that each person will have to make based on, an accurate representation that you give them. So they might ask about locations that are likely to be more similar to their own country in terms of disability access and attitudes, or a program with a different format. Try to get creative when approaching access challenges. Could a makeshift ramp or a portable shower chair be the solution to an otherwise inaccessible building or homestay? Is there another participant willing to act as a sighted guide or personal assistant, perhaps even in exchange for a reduced program fee? Many smartphone and tablet apps are used for foreign language learning or translation or currency conversion that are becoming really popular among people with disabilities, such as people with learning disabilities. Finally, if a program component is not accessible, ask yourself, is it really essential to the program, or consider having alternatives. One example that I heard was how one volunteer abroad program in Thailand organized a cultural excursion to a historic site for the visitors. Oh, does anyone else? Oh, okay, great. Sorry about that. So anyway, a person with a disability was unable to participate in one of the in the excursion, so they were able to come up with like an alternative. So they had people could choose whether they wanted to go hiking up this monument or go to an art museum or a national park. Finally, if a let's see. For more information about any of these topics that I just discussed, plus more, you can always contact MIUSA. Like Anne said at the beginning of the webinar, we administer a service called the National Clearinghouse on Disability and Exchange, which is sponsored by the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. And this service is provided specifically to assist people with their questions about how people with disabilities can be included in international programs, specifically between the U.S. and other countries. So we're here for you. NCDE staff produce publications, we lead workshops, and respond to information and referral requests ongoingly. Our website is a great resource for disability-specific tip sheets, stories, and profiles by people with disabilities who share their exchange experiences, tools and tip sheets for exchange professionals, including best practices. We'd love to hear your best practices as well. People can use our database of disability organizations around the world. They can search for helpful links related to disability and travel, plug into our social media and blog, or they can sign up for our monthly e-news, access free publications, and more. In fact, at the end of this month, we are going to be releasing the latest issue of our Away Topics series, which is on the topic of citizen diplomats with disabilities. It will be free to order or download on our website, and we'll send a link to all of the registrants of this webinar once it becomes available. Well, I want to thank you again for saving your questions for the end. I'm really pleased to now turn the mic over to my colleague Megan Smith. Megan is the International Exchange Programs Assistant at MIUSA and helps organize and facilitate our inbound and our outbound exchange programs. She is a gifted writer and writes articles for MIUSA in its blog. She also speaks about her travels and traveling with a disability at conferences. Megan uses a power wheelchair, and she's been to at least 25 countries, including volunteer abroad in Costa Rica, Peru, Nepal, and Morocco, and worked in countries such as Afghanistan. Some interesting facts about Megan is that she's addicted to Moroccan mint tea and kebabs and enjoys long rolls on the beach and having men carry her up mountains. So I'm now going to turn it over to Megan.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And I just request if anyone cannot understand me, please message me and say, repeat what you said. Thank you so much. So as Ashley said, I am the International Exchange Program Assistant here. And I use a power wheelchair due to cerebral palsy. In fact, next week I will be leading an exchange to Spain, where I will be taking 8 young adults with disabilities to Madrid, where we will be exploring the beautiful city of Madrid, but also learning about disability rights and doing leadership activities. So I wanted to first speak about my volunteering abroad experiences and how the organizations that I went with adapted to my disability and without inhibiting the program or the other members in the programs. So at 16, I was determined to leave the US and go abroad. So I found Cross-Cultural Solutions volunteer program. And I contacted them, and they said, we have never had a person with a disability, but you know what? We're willing to work with you. So I chose Costa Rica as the first destination for my volunteer abroad experience. And throughout the, I believe, 3-month process beforehand, Cross-Cultural Solutions worked with me regarding, well, if the bathroom isn't accessible, would you be willing to have assistance, or would just a plank of wood be alright to gain access into the volunteer housing space? And so I arrived there having very little experience abroad, and them having very little, if any, experience with volunteers with disabilities. And we had this marvelous experience because for example, the volunteer abroad housing was not accessible. So there was 3 steps going into the housing. And what they did was they put 2 pieces of plywood down and a couple bricks to stabilize it, and it worked beautifully. And it cost probably $2. So that was the extent of my accommodation in regards to accessibility. And also, because the volunteer transport was in a bus that was not, of course, wheelchair accessible, what they did with, of course, my input was that they had the bus driver lift me into the bus and then lift my wheelchair into the back. And that way, they didn't need to buy a whole new bus with a lift for a wheelchair. And it, again, worked perfectly for my volunteer abroad experience. I worked in a children's daycare center and also an elderly home. And it was a crazy experience having so many children, like monkeys, climbing all over me and pulling on my wheelchair and at times unplugging it. So, but it was amazing, and I think it was amazing for the community that I was in as I showed up and they're like, what are we doing with a disabled volunteer? We're gonna have to take care of her instead of her assisting us. And by the end of it, they really valued my contribution, and I feel that it really opened their minds to the usefulness and the contribution that people with disabilities can make in their community. So that was after Costa Rica. I moved on to Peru with cross-cultural solutions. Had an equally amazing experience there. Very different country, of course. But I will speak about my volunteer experience in Nepal, as that is probably the most inaccessible country I've ever been to. And so with Nepal, I actually went to a domestic, I went with a domestic grassroots organization that was Nepalese. Basically, one guy was working out of his house to organize these volunteers and connecting them with local NGOs and orphanages. So with this experience, I worked in an orphanage for Tibetan refugees, and and of course it was in a very typical Nepalese house. So it was up a flight of very steep stairs, of which we sort of put down 2 car doors that were in the scrapyard, and they nailed it down to the wood stairs, and it made this perfect ramp out of scrap car doors. So, and that's how I gained access to the orphanage. And also, initially, I had to stay in a homestay because I did not find accessible housing. And that was a very interesting experience because I stayed with the man who organized the volunteer experiences. And again, his house was on the 4th floor of this walk-up building. And I mean, initially, everyone would say that is probably the most inaccessible place that you could ever have a homestay, and it was true. However, what they did was they had a villager from the community help me. So what he would do is I would go to work every day at the orphanage. He would meet me at the house. And then he would carry me up, plop me down in the chair, and then carry up my wheelchair. And while it was definitely not ideal, as I probably could not get out if there was a fire or anything else, it worked. And it was wonderful. I got to spend time with his daughter, who would wake me up at 4:30 in the morning every day. And it was a truly wonderful homestay experience. So lastly, I just want to speak about my study abroad experience in Spain. as it was coordinated by CIEE, and they did an amazing job with accommodating me without, I guess, basically working with me in figuring out what would work best. So there, I did not have a homestay experience. I did live on my own in an apartment. And what happened was my wheelchair kept on constantly breaking, and it was a nightmare. But they actually coordinated with local mechanics to help me out, and they actually, like Ashley was mentioning, had set aside a small fund for incidentals regarding disability or accommodation. And again, at the university, my classroom was not accessible, so they just had it moved down to the first floor of the old university, and it was very accessible. And so, lastly, with CIE, I went to Morocco with an internship volunteer abroad experience, and they were initially very hesitant because they're like, "Oh, we will be in a small van. We will be traversing very inaccessible places in Morocco, hiking up mountains." And like Ashley was saying about challenge by choice, I'm like, "Oh, I am totally down with that. I love going to the most inaccessible places in the world." And so with them, after a little bit of convincing and calming them down about legal issues, that I will not sue them, that they really thought creatively. And at one point, as you can see in the picture, I left my wheelchair and just rode a camel. So it's all about creativity and working with the student, or the delegate, or the person with a disability. And I will conclude my talk. But I will say lastly that it really is a unique experience to have someone with a disability on a program. And it really does enrich the experience both for the program participants who see me, I guess, like ride on the back of a man up a mountain and participate in the same activities as they do, just in a different way. And it also enriches the community to change this view of people with disabilities. So, please let me know if you have any questions. And I would love to say thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Actually, Megan, this is Ashley again. I hope you'll stick around a little bit. I'd like to invite people we have about 10 minutes, invite people to ask their questions in the chat box, and you can either ask questions for me, Ashley, or you can ask questions for Megan. And we'll try to answer as many as we can. Does anyone have any questions? If so, just go ahead and type them in the chat window. Well, if you do think of questions later on, there will be an opportunity to email us here at MIUSA at the email address clearinghouse@miusa.org if you have any questions related to disability and exchange. Let's see, we have a question. are there people on the webinar today who have disabilities and have volunteered abroad? Oh, that's a great question. So that's a question for our participants today. If anyone's willing to identify themselves as someone who has a disability and has gone abroad for citizen diplomacy related experience. Franz has. Absolutely. Steve asked, is it possible to get a copy of the PowerPoint? I'm going to try to make the recording and the PowerPoint both available publicly, and if I'm successful at that, I'll share the link in a follow-up email with everyone. Stephanie is saying, the presentation got me thinking about how I can help incoming international students who may come from countries where disability awareness isn't as prominent. That's very true, Stephanie. There are a lot of countries where, like I was saying, there are different stages of disability rights, and in some countries, it might be harder to do outreach to people with disabilities, especially if they, don't have the same access to education or employment as we do, or as people do in other countries. So it might be more challenging, but we'll definitely try to share as many resources as we can. And it's wonderful that you're thinking about, your international students who are going to be coming on future programs. Lori says, thanks to Megan for sharing info about your personal experiences. She has a lot more where that came from too. In fact, on our website, on the NCDE website, which I mentioned earlier, that we have a lot of stories, blogs, and other materials that people with disabilities wrote about their experiences abroad. And we have them organized by, in all sorts of different ways, from what program type. So are you looking for people with disabilities who went on volunteer programs, or who went on internship programs, or who did professional development? We also have them organized by disability category. And then we also have them organized by destination country. So if you were looking for stories by people with disabilities who went to Peru, you might find a story there by Megan, as well as some other folks as well. And stories are a great way to help you think creatively, and also to share with other people with disabilities who are considering having an international experience. I saw a few more questions float by. Let's see here. Joel says, if anyone with a disability also has great stories from their experiences abroad, we encourage you to share your story on the U.S. Center for Citizen Diplomacy website. That's a great point, Joel. So many of you indicated in our poll earlier that you've known someone with a disability in your programs. Encourage them to share their story. Try to get them to get the word out so that people with disabilities will have that voice and have that presence, the online presence, and also in the materials. Mayusa also actively encourages people to share their stories. We're always trying to share new ones and learn about new destinations and access, and to improve our knowledge of disability in other countries. Let's see, Emily wrote, this is more of a suggestion. I know that not all people with disabilities are the same, but it might be a great option for those hosting international visitors to come up with a listing of areas or towns, cultural activities, etc., that are accessible to keep for office reference. It's certainly a great idea to take note of local resources, whether you're looking for adaptive recreation opportunities or local independent living centers. That's a really wonderful idea, Emily. Thanks for mentioning that. We have a couple, about 1 or 2 more minutes for questions or comments before I invite Diane to close us out. All right. Well, again, please let me know if you have any more questions that you think of later at the email clearinghouse@myuse.org, and we will certainly try to make all of these materials accessible to you in a follow-up email. Thank you so much for your participation. Really enjoyed having you all here on this webinar today, and again, very excited to learn about all of your efforts and experiences. I'm going to turn the mic over to Diane now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Diane Rasmussen. I'm the Director of Communications at the U.S. Center for Citizen Diplomacy. And I first just wanted to thank Ashley, Megan, and Mayusa for their partnership and proactivity on presenting this topic for us today. I hope everyone found the information inspiring and also relevant to your work. I think that in order to grow the community of citizen diplomats, we certainly need to be as inclusive as possible in the field. So I think it's really key that there's an organization out here that can help with that, and that it's great to see all of these participants today who have already accommodated and included folks with disabilities in your program. So thank you. Just a couple of quick follow-up items, and then I see there are a couple of other questions, so if we have a few minutes, I'll turn it back over to Ashley. But as this is our first webinar that we've presented in partnership with one of our members, really looking to all of you to provide us with some feedback as far as this webinar, as well as others that you'd like to see, what topics you'd like to see in the future. So please let us know. You can either contact us, my information is on the screen, and you can contact me at the info@ address there. Or there's also going to be a survey sent out, and we would really love for you to take a few minutes. It's very short to give us some feedback on that too. Secondly, and finally, I just wanted to make sure everyone's aware of the U.S. Center for Citizen Diplomacy's website. We might have a few people out there who aren't, and the resources that are available on it, as well as membership opportunities. I see there are several members that tapped in today, and I want to shout out big welcome to them, and let you know that as Anne mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, our website now houses about 1,700 organizations that do citizen diplomacy of some nature and offer opportunities for people to get involved and engage with other citizens around the world. So of those 1,700, we now offer a membership for any organizations who want additional promotion, want to have a more comprehensive listing of their opportunities on our website. We try and keep it very reasonable, so it's based on your own organization's budget. So if you'd like more information about that, please go to the homepage at US Center for Citizen Diplomacy.org or USC, the number 4, CD.org. Sometimes that's a little easier. And there's a couple of places to note on the website. The orange box in the center is our program search, where it's available to anyone to help them find an organization or opportunity to get engaged internationally. And if your organization is not listed there, there's an Add Your Org button where you can submit your organization for listing. And secondly, there's a membership button that's also orange up in the right-hand corner. And then Joel, who had chatted with everyone a little earlier, is our lead blogger, and we do a lot of highlighting of our organizations on our blog and social media as well. So we like to extend your outreach to a bigger audience is basically our goal. So thank you again, everyone, for participating, and to Ashley and Megan for their webinar today. And I will turn it back over to Ashley.
Thank you, Diane. This is Ashley again. Well, it looks like we're out of time and we have to let our captioner go, but I just wanted to quickly address Anna's question. Yes, she asked if other implementing organizations could gather resources from MyUSA. We are happy to work one-on-one with any organization that sends or receives people between the U.S. and other countries. However, if they do exchanges between non-U.S. countries to other non-U.S. countries, they are certainly welcome to visit our website, as we have a lot of helpful resources that may also have some useful information for them as well. And Jay Kreiser's comment about resources for gathering details about the specific needs of individuals. Yes, and I saw someone reply, MyUSA does have assessment forms that are available for free on our website by disability, so that it can help guide your discussions with the individual to determine, what they would need through a series of questions. Well, let's see. Looks like we're out of time. Thank you again, everyone. Look for the email that we'll be sending out a little later to follow up. And really look forward to working with all of you or answering any questions that you might have later on. Thanks again.